A very good afternoon to everyone, every participant and our invited guest. On behalf of the Department of Anthropology, Mrinalini Datta Mahavidyapith, I, Dr. Suchishmita Sen-Chaudhuri, Assistant Professor in the Department of Anthropology, I welcome you all in this webinar on Indigenous rights, issues and challenges, organized by the Department of Anthropology in collaboration with Internal Quality Assurance Cell of our college, Mrinalini Datta Mahavidyapith, with wholehearted support from Honorable President of Governing Body, Srimati Chandrima Bhattacharya, and blessings from our Principal Sir, Dr. Apurva Bandyopadhyay. Regarding the topic of today's webinar, I must point out that there are nearly 370 million indigenous people living in the world, having various connotations of the term at various parts of the world and various countries, different countries. And thus, this issue is a very much global issue. And we are very much glad that we have two eminent scholars, Professor Hossain and Professor Castro among us to discuss the issue indigenous rights, challenges, issues and challenges. So I would like to share the platform to Dr. Suman Chakraborty for giving his welcome address now. Thank you. Over to Suman.
Thank you, Dr. Suchishmita Sen-Chaudhuri. I think this day is very memorable for us, particularly the student of anthropology of our department, as because the dream came the true picture and true sense today. So at first, good afternoon to all of you, and from India, of course, as because the participants that are joining from the different parts of the world. So from that context, I'd like to tell them as good morning and also the good afternoon and good night too. So at the outset, I must wish all of you a very happy and prosperous New Year 2021. And now that our honorable president of our governing body of our institute, Srimati Chandrima Bhattacharya, our honorable principal sir, Dr. Apurva Bandyopadhyay, our IKC coordinator, Dr. Mithali Gangopadhyay, our colleagues from my institute, also the other institute, the student of anthropology and other subjects, and all. It is my pleasure to extend a cheerful and welcome to all of you. Your presence makes us very happy. I extend my special welcome to our eminent speaker today, Professor Kamrul Hossain from University of Lapland, Finland, and also Professor Nestor Castro from University of Philippines. They have agreed to join us and they will give us a complete picture regarding our today's webinar on indigenous issues and challenges based on the rights of their particular things. Now, before we introduce the main theme of our webinar, as I told you, the dream came true today because we have planned to organize this webinar before 1 year, I think. So we have discussed in our institutional meeting and also our departmental meeting. Now today we can establish that the indigenous issues is very, very important, not only in Indian context, but also the beyond India. As we know that indigenous is a term which is used differently in the different nations, and UN declarations in 2007, in 13 September, some of the countries, but most of the countries signed the rights of the indigenous peoples. Apart from that, some of them, they abstain or they absent for that particular issues in order to give them much more protection to get the sustainable livelihood, life, and their survival. So the name indigenous is important for the global term, but indigenous, the recognitions of the people basically confined to the different countries and recognitions
ไม่
along
จะ
with
จะเข้า
the
ฟังนี่ไม่ติดละมันต้อง
along
เปิด
with
กัน
the different kind of nomenclature. In India, we generally term the indigenous people as so-called the scheduled tribal people, and official record shows that there are near about more than 700 indigenous people, including the subgroups, who are distributed in the different parts of the India. Now the question arises that the conditions of the Indian tribal populations and their governance and their rights, we are very much aware of this fact. What kind of movement happened temporarily before colonization and post-colonization, we aware very much. We studied a lot of them. But now the question came, then what are the conditions of those people who are living in the other parts of the countries, as because out of these main indigenous group throughout the world, more than 30% of the groups, they are living in Southeast Asian countries. And also there's the unique features of the Arctic populations who are living in the northern globe and specifically in the Siberian regions. So that's why we invited two specialists who are extensively worked in Professor Kamrul Hossain in Arctic populations and Professor Nestor Castro, who work on the indigenous population of Southeast Asian countries. We are fortunate enough, we welcome a million times for their kind presence and for their deliberations in this particular webinar. So hopefully, again, I welcome to all of you, specifically the students and the participants and the viewers from the Facebook page, and also the different experts who are ready to keen to understand the indigenous rights issues and challenges. So at last, I welcome you all again, once again, for your kind presence. Sujishmita, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shuman Chakraborty. And now I would like to request Dr. Mitali Gangopadhyay, coordinator of IQAC as well as head of the Department of English of Mrinalini Datta Mahavidyapith. As I must say, she is one of the most important inspiration to us. I will request her to say a few words regarding the webinar. Over to Mitali.
Thank you so much, Shuchishmita. It's a pleasure to be here. A very, very good afternoon and a warm welcome to all of you present on this platform today in this one-day international webinar, which is entitled Indigenous Rights, Issues and Challenges. This is organized by the Department of Anthropology in association with the Internal Quality Cell, Assurance Cell of our college, Mrinalini Datta Mahavidyapith. We are extremely delighted to have among us two eminent speakers today. Professor Dr. Kamrul Hossain, Research Professor and Director, NIEML, University of Lapland, Finland. We extend our warm welcome to you, sir, and look forward to hear from you the different aspects of global indigenous movements and how they lead in their own ways to achieve the right to self-determination. We are also happy to have with us Professor Dr. Nestor Castro, Department of Anthropology, University of Philippines, who will focus on the indigenous people of Southeast Asia and the challenges they face in regard to their rights. if I have to talk about the Department of Anthropology, I have to say that it is a department which is constantly engaged with a number of programs. And such programs not only focus on pedagogy, but also on generating social awareness through academics. The Department of Anthropology is, I would request everyone to kindly mute their audio. Thank you. As I was saying, that the Department of Anthropology is extremely vibrant because the department has industrious faculties who, leave no stones unturned to combine this theoretical teaching with practical fieldwork. What I exactly mean to say is that the department is not only teaching about indigenous people, in India or abroad, but the department takes every effort to take the students as much as practicable to these lands where they can meet the marginalized people and learn to see life from their perspective and learn much more about them than just reading about them in the books. At the end, I would like to wish a very happy new year to all of you, a corona-free year to all of you, and I hope this webinar ultimately turns out to be a grand success. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I thank you very much, Dr. Mitali Gangopadhyay. Mitali Di is always speaks some encouraging words towards anthropology department, and it encourages us to do something better for near future. Anyway, now we will start. I will request, before starting, I will request Ms. Tanushree Polle, one of the experienced teacher of our department, who is specialized in social cultural anthropology. I would like to request Tanushree to speak a few words regarding Dr. Kamrul Hossain before he begins. Tanushree.
Hello everyone, good afternoon, and very happy new year to all of you. Welcome to today's session, and it's a one-day international seminar on indigenous rights, issues and challenges. I'm Mrs. Tanushree Polle, Faculty Department of Anthropology, Mrinalini Datta Mahavidyapith, and I have got the opportunity to introduce our first eminent speaker, that is Professor Dr. Kamrul Hossain, Research Professor and Director NIEML, that is Northern Institute of Environmental and Minority Law, Artic Center, University of Lapland, Finland. And it's a great pleasure to me to introduce him. And he is also an adjunct professor at Public International Law at the University of Lapland. He is the leader of the University of Arctic Thematic Network on Arctic Law. Although by training, he has specialized in international law, and his research focus on currently lies in probably to international environmental law and human rights law, particularly concerning the rights of the indigenous peoples that applies to the Arctic. Over his academic career, Professor Hossain has extensively published in almost all areas of Arctic governance, such as in climatic change, our environmental protection, security and geopolitics, biodiversity, marine environment and the law of the sea, human rights and human security. It has been the principal investigator of a significant number of international and national research projects funded by the agencies such as the Academy of the Finland, the NORSPRO, the Nordic Council of Ministers of the Council of Baltic Sea States, etc. He has had several visiting positions in several renowned foreign universities, such as the Law School of Harbin University, such as the Law School of Harbin Institute of Technology in China, University of Technology, Sydney, and as a visiting scholar to the number of other institutes like University of Toronto, Canada, Hokkaido, and the Moran University of Technology, Japan. Thus, the Polar Research Institute of a number of Cambridge, the UK, etc. He served as special editor for several international scientific journals, including Yearbook of Polar Law, and regularly teaches at the University of Lapland and periodically at the other universities of other foreign universities of Europe and Asia. He received a number of prestigious awards, including SYLFF's Fellowship of University of Helsinki, Cone Foundation Postdoctorate Fellowship, Faculty Research Fellowship by the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, DFA, IT, etc. Finally, now may I invite our eminent speaker, Professor Dr. Kamrul Hossain, to enlighten his topic and enrich us. And his topic is Global Indigenous Movement to Achieving a Right to Self-Determination. Welcome, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, Tanushree. It was very kind of you. So let me share my screen before I start talking. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for inviting me to this exciting event. I'm very grateful to Mrinalini Datta Mahavidyapith, and especially my sincere thanks to Professor Shumon Chakraborty, who has invited me to this seminar. And Shumon and I was friends for last several years, and we had the opportunity to meet each other in several occasions, including once in Mrinalini Datta Mahavidyapith. So it was a pleasure, and I'm honored to have this opportunity to speak in front of you on this important topic about Indigenous rights. And the title of this seminar, as you have already learned, is Indigenous Rights, Issues and Challenges. And my talk will be about global Indigenous movement to achieving a right to self-determination. So what I would like to present in my talk, I would touch upon two issues. The first, how Indigenous peoples' movement has reached in today's position and what was the process. So I will briefly talk about the process of Indigenous peoples' movement and what were the aims of the movement. So one of the aims of the movement was to have recognition in international legal framework in order to achieve a right to self-determination. And in this context, I will talk also about a right to self-determination, what it is understood in present-day context. So my own argument about right to self-determination will be that we have enough of normative standards concerning right to self-determination, but I would suggest that now it is time to implement how we implement right to self-determination as it applies to Indigenous people in all across the world. So before I start talking on these 2 points, let me first give you an introduction about who the Indigenous people are. In the beginning, Shuchi has already mentioned that there are over 370 million Indigenous people in all across the world. So these 370 million, also in some literature, it was suggested the number of Indigenous people are almost 400 million in all across the world, but they are divided into 5,000 different groups, and they have around 4,000 different languages, and they are split into over 70 countries in all across the world. So the problem of Indigenous people is that there is no clear legal definition of who the Indigenous people are. So because of the lack of definition, it was complex when we talk about a right to self-determination that applies to Indigenous people. To understand who the Indigenous people are, there was a definition. It was given by, it is called actually COBO definition. COBO definition means that definition given by UN Special Rapporteur of the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and protection of minorities. The special reporter, his name was Martinez Cobo, and he has given this working definition in order to put forward indigenous peoples' issues. In his famous study, the name of the study was The Problem of Discrimination Against Indigenous People. He sets out a number of criteria to understand indigenous people. So these criteria include, for example, historical continuity on their territory. Before they were colonized, I mean, before the indigenous peoples were colonized by settlers. They are distinct groups of people, and they are identified by their own culture, own way of livelihood, own worldview, own cosmology, language, practice of religion. And in current context, they are not dominant social group on the land in which they live. But still, these groups of people are determined to preserve, to develop, and to transmit to future generations their ancestral territories, their culture, their ethnic identity. And they still exist as people in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions, and legal system. And that is how we understand indigenous people in international context. But then again, there are different kind of connotation about indigenous peoples in national constitutions. So in this regard, I also would like to mention that indigenous peoples in all across the world are not known with the term indigenous people. In different countries, they are known by different terminologies. For example, in Australia, these groups of people are called Aboriginal. In North America, in Canada, and in USA, for example, they are called First Nations or Native Indians, etc. And in Indian subcontinent, as Professor Shumon has already mentioned, that they are called, in India especially, they are called scheduled tribes. And the country where I'm originally from, in Bangladesh, we called a small ethnic tribal people. So there are different names when we refer to indigenous people, but commonly we understand them as indigenous people because their movement has started with this terminology, and United Nations has recognized them, all of them, as indigenous people. But then they have kind of common issues by which we recognize them. For example, in all across the world, these groups of people are subjected to similar kind of treatments. So their lands and resources were conquered, they were marginalized, they were assimilated, they suffered from historical injustices, and they have clear and concrete attachments to nature and nature-based livelihood. So they are the indigenous people. Now let me move to the struggle they have started for them to get recognition in international politics or in international legal framework. So these groups of people, indigenous peoples, were not organized in early 19th century because they have their own worldview, they have their own cosmology, they have their own knowledge system, they have their own ways of life. So they did not recognize the private ownership of land. So they don't have any ownership of land. They were having a huge territory on which they were moving. At some point, most of the indigenous people were nomadic in many of the countries. So therefore, they were enjoying the lands and resources of the lands. And they have, as I said, that clear connection to nature. But then when Eurocentric international legal development took place, their indigenous peoples' issues were not recognized, simply because there were no knowledge about the differences of systems in maintaining the ways of life. So therefore, indigenous peoples were not recognized. In early 19th century, there were a number of indigenous peoples leaders who realized that they have been gradually and increasingly marginalized and pushed in their own lands. And they started, by realizing these issues, they started kind of approaching to the existing international body. For example, in 1920, especially during 1920s and also in 1930s, these leaders of indigenous people, they moved to League of Nations, at that time the Club of States, and asked them to recognize them as distinct people, as having right to self-determination and not to be marginalized by the settlers. But their issues were not actually taken seriously at that point. And then, as I said, that indigenous people have their different knowledge system and different understanding of looking the world. They were not much formally organized. And because of their non-formal organization, they were not kind of recognized in international bodies where they could present themselves as having a strong entities. But when United Nations was created in 1945, again, these indigenous peoples leaders, they approached to the United Nations. And the purpose of creation of the United Nations was to maintain international peace and security. And it is a club, again, of the states, not of other entities. So states were the only actors in United Nations, and indigenous peoples' issues were lying within the states. So that's the intra-state matters, and United Nations was dealing with interstate relationship. Therefore, they didn't find any place to accommodate indigenous people within the framework of United Nations. Instead, United Nations asked these groups of people to negotiate with their national state to gain recognition in their national constitution and to achieve rights within the national legal system. And then indigenous leaders went back to their national government. So they were negotiating, consulting, and also appealing to the national government to address their issues. In some countries, or in some several occasions, some of the indigenous groups in some countries, they started armed rebellion against their own national government. But then there was a consensus among international lawyers that indigenous issues were part of the domestic issues, and they have to be dealt with within the nation state, because nation states were composed of the principle of sovereignty, which means that they have absolute rights, or states have absolute rights to deal with the issues that are within their own domestic territorial domain. And at some point it is said that, you know, this Westphalian concept of sovereignty that undermined indigenous people's issues, because the lands and territories that were occupied by the colonial power was on the name of terra nullius. The concept you can find in international law. Terra nullius means nobody's land, but in fact it was the lands, they were the lands of indigenous people. So nobody's land concept was included in international law to give the states the monopoly to force and to conquer indigenous people's lands. So as you can see that there were this non-inclusion within international legal framework to address indigenous people's issues. Then what happened? These indigenous people's leaders, they were, as I said, that very sporadically addressing their issues to international community. And they started realizing that they need to have formal organization. And by having formal organization, they will have a power to negotiate with existing structures within the context of, you know, international political society. Within international political society, they will have a place to negotiate, and in order to negotiate, they have to have their own organizations. So in 1956, the Sami Council was established as a non-governmental organization. And Sami Council was the organization of Sami people, and Sami are the indigenous people of Finland, Sweden, and Norway. And Sami also live in Russia's Kola Peninsula. So in 4 countries, this group of people are living, and they have gathered, and they have organized and they established their own organization, own institution called the Sami Council. And then in 1968, International Working Group for Indigenous Affairs was established. The idea was that to promote indigenous people's rights, to clearly identify what are the common issues that lie for all indigenous people in all across the world, so that you can start negotiating on the basis of those common elements. And then in 1974, World Council for Indigenous Peoples was established. And this council also invited indigenous representations from all across the world to join the effort they take to promote or to kind of, put forward the rights of indigenous people and to create an awareness about indigenous people's rights so that world community can understand the differences, the distinction, and the justification for which indigenous people claim their rights. In 1973, Arctic Peoples Conference was convened, and Arctic indigenous peoples were in the forefront to promote indigenous people's rights. And in this conference, the participants were from most of the Arctic countries, including from North American Arctic, Finno-Scandinavia, Russia, and also from Greenland. Then in 1977, there was a Pan-Arctic conference convened, and this conference resulted in establishing Inuit Circumpolar Council. And Inuit Circumpolar Council is an organization that today represents over 150,000 Inuit people living in 4 countries. And these 4 countries include Alaska, for example, from United States, Canada, Canadian North, and Russia, and also from Greenland. So this is how indigenous people have established their transnational network. And through this transnational network, they gained kind of a political recognition to negotiate with international community to promote their rights. And this way, they raised their issue to the United Nations. And United Nations, as I said, that at the early phase, did not recognize the rights of indigenous people as distinct because those are the indigenous people's issues were treated as issues, as domestic issues to be negotiated with the national government. But then because of the transnational networks and transnational organizations and because of the specific issues concerning indigenous people's rights that were presented in many international forums, gradually indigenous people's rights were recognized within the framework of United Nations system. And how? Here you see, in 1982, UN Working Group on Indigenous People's Rights was established, and the idea of establishing this group was to identify specific rights that belong to indigenous people. Why indigenous people will have to be treated differently? Because they were also colonized at different point of time. So the main purpose of the working group was to prepare a declaration on the rights of indigenous people. And that declaration was prepared and draft declaration was finalized in 1994. But then this declaration at that time was not adopted, and it took 13 more years. As you have learned in the beginning from the introduction given by Professor Shumon, that in 2007, finally indigenous peoples UN declaration on the rights of indigenous people was adopted. And this was a huge success. So I will probably come back to this point later on. Here I just would like to give you some brief idea about how within United Nations system, indigenous peoples issues were addressed. So when this UN working group on the rights of indigenous people were there, and when draft declaration was adopted in 1994, and when the draft declaration was finalized and finally approved, finally signed in 2007, this working group was then replaced by another group which is called UN Expert Mechanism, which is still continuing its function. UN Expert Mechanism established in 2007, actually it is renamed of the UN Working Group on Indigenous people's rights. And meanwhile, there was another organization created within the framework of United Nations. It's called United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. It was established in the year 2000. The idea of establishing this permanent forum was to raise indigenous people's voices in all UN systems. And along with this, an interagency support group was established, and UN Permanent Forum has had its first session in 2002, and it acts as an advisory body to the United Nations Economic and Social Council, in short, which is called ECOSOC. So there are three existing institutions within United Nations system. One is Expert Mechanism, as I said. Other one is Indigenous Peoples Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And the third one is UN Expert Mechanism. Third one is Special Rapporteur. And Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous people, it was established by a decision taken in 2001, and it has a specific mandate concerning the implementation of the rights that are embodied within the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And it also do thematic studies on different issues on indigenous people, and acts as a coordinating body, and also identify the problems and implement the recommendation given by UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous People. So there are these three main institutions. And then one of the major events that took place actually in 2014, and it was by virtue of a resolution adopted by General Assembly in 2010 to discuss indigenous people's issues in a high-level plenary session of the General Assembly. It was called World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. And that conference presented the idea of best practice, how to implement indigenous people's rights as embodied in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But then indigenous people's issues were also found within international legal framework, mainly within the human rights instruments. So there are these instruments, as you see from this slide: International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, adopted in 1966, International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, adopted in 1966, and International Convention on Elimination of All Form of Racial Discrimination, adopted again in 1996. But the problem was that all these three conventions, three human rights treaties, as I referred to, they did not clearly refer to indigenous people. However, some of the provisions of these treaties, they clearly are linked to indigenous people's rights. And later, the treaty monitoring bodies, which are the authoritative bodies and which have the role to, clear role to implement the provisions of the covenants, the provision of this, human rights treaties, they clearly addressed, or they clearly articulated that indigenous people's rights are rights to be covered within the framework of these treaties. For example, if we look at International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it has an article that gives minority that is about minority protection, that gives protection to national minorities. Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights clearly says that in those countries where minorities are living, they have specific rights concerning practice of their culture, religion, and language. And indigenous people in most of the countries are considered minorities. And therefore, this minority protection article is clearly linked to indigenous people. They have right to enjoy their culture, not only individually, but also in community with other members. And this has got reaffirmation when in 1994, within the covenant, the treaty monitoring body is called Human Rights Committee. Human Rights Committee has adopted General Comment 23. And General Comment means that the Human Rights Committee interpret how the article, how specific article is applicable. So when interpreting Article 27 in General Comment 23, Human Rights Committee clearly referred to indigenous people and clearly saying that indigenous people, their tradition, their culture that are composed of, for example, traditional activities, traditional practices in connection to their lands, hunting, fishing, gathering, and these kind of activities are part of cultures and thereby protected under Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And same thing happened within the framework of International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Article 15, paragraph 1, which says that everybody has right to take part in cultural life, and the state's duty is to protect and also to take affirmative action to promote the rights. It's not only to prevent the activities that affect the culture, it is also about to take effective measure to promote the rights. And that was confirmed by another authoritative statement, General Comment 21, given by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the treaty monitoring body, in 2009, clearly recognizing that indigenous people belong to this specific part and they are protected by Article 15, paragraph 1 of the covenant. And not only individually, but also to enjoy or to take part in cultural life in community with other members. So there you see that there are both individual dimensions and also collective dimensions when we talk about the indigenous people's rights within the framework of human rights treaties. Same goes with Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And there was a general recommendation adopted by the committee, the authoritative statement. Committee meaning that, as I said, that they interpret, they give the clear interpretation how specific articles, how the provisions of the treaties could be, must be interpreted. So there it says that racial discrimination, all form of racial discrimination convention applies to indigenous people. But then only one international legal document so far is adopted what has the legal implication in international legal framework is called ILO Convention, International Labour Organization Convention 169, that directly address indigenous people. And that is the only legally binding convention in force that talks about indigenous people's rights in regard to participation in decision-making, consultation, and also remedy when there are injuries on indigenous people's lands and resources. But the problem about this convention is that even though it is a legally binding convention, this has a very, very poor ratification. So far, if I remember correct, only 23 countries ratified the convention, and most of the parties who ratified the convention, they are indigenous majority states, like in South American states, where Bolivia, Peru, that kind of countries. From the Arctic countries, it was only Norway who ratified the convention. Of course, Denmark ratified the convention, but in Denmark, there are no indigenous peoples. So Denmark rule Greenland, but Greenland has its self-rule government. So Greenland is the majority population of Greenland are indigenous Inuit people. Only 7,000 people are Danish origin native people. But in any case, so as I said, that there were only a small number of countries who ratified the convention. But then African Charter on Human and People's Rights is a human rights convention applicable to Africa, where they have also referred to indigenous people in some of their documents, some of their resolutions. But then in addition to human rights treaties, indigenous people's issues were also addressed in other legal framework. For example, in 1922, Rio Conference was convened. Probably you are aware of that. It was called UN Conference on Environment and Development. There, a declaration, Rio Declaration, was adopted, and in Rio Declaration, first time, it provided one principle, Principle 22. It clearly says about indigenous people's knowledge, their traditional knowledge and importance of traditional knowledge in regard to environmental management and biodiversity convention. And that was further even included in the Convention on Biological Diversity, and that was also adopted in 1992. There was a specific article, Article 8J, that talks about indigenous peoples, and of course, not only about indigenous people, but also about local peoples, knowledge and innovation. And then also it talks about the importance of those knowledge and to include those knowledge in biodiversity management. And also where their knowledge is used, they are entitled to receive benefit sharing from the use of biodiversity. So there you see that indigenous people's issues were recognized not only within the framework of human rights treaties, but also within the framework of other international legal developments. And then this has raised question whether when indigenous people have already gained this kind of recognition and their issues, their knowledge and their systems are recognized, and it was much more understandable in the current context how indigenous people's issues are relevant, then it was then the time came up to discuss about how indigenous people have how this recognition could lead to have a right to self-determination. But then self-determination has many different meanings, and there are different kind of claims when you talk about self-determination. It is a very contested term, but it is a norm that you can see in international law. Also, it is a norm, it is an international political principle in relation to territorial integrity, democracy, sovereignty, and so on. It has both internal dimension and external dimension. I will talk about that in a few minutes about internal and external perspective of self-determination. So here I just would like to say that self-determination in general, it means that right of all peoples to freely determine their own destiny, to freely determine their own political status, and to freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural well-being. So in the document, in international legal documents, you will find self-determination attached to peoples. So that is confusing. Who are the people? That has not been clearly articulated nowhere. When self-determination itself was not interpreted clearly, how it should be, how it should apply, to whom it should apply. At the same time, who are the peoples? When it says people's right to self-determination, and this term peoples were not also clearly articulated nowhere in international legal instrument. So if you go to the UN Charter, the Charter of the United Nations, you will see the reference to right to self-determination in Article 1 and also in Article 55. In Article 1 says that the purpose of the United Nations is to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. Similarly, in Article 55, it highlighted that the respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination for observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, and religion. Then in the UN Charter, as I said, that it says clearly the right applies to the people, but it did not interpret who these peoples are. There remains unclarity, there remains non-explanation, therefore it becomes a vague element. And it was very ambiguous as to argue that who are the entity to claim a right to self-determination and to what extent, meaning that what does it mean? Because when you look at Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter, it is about protecting territorial integrity and political independence. In other words, sovereignty. So sovereignty is inviolable. It cannot be violated. So if sovereignty cannot be violated, and then when you talk about self-determination in the context of achieving statehood or independence, then it contradicts. So there are these complex issues, and how these complex issues will have to be dealt was not clear. But then in 1960, United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution. It called Resolution 1514. And in Resolution 1514, it resulted in a declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples, saying that a right to self-determination applies to colonial people who were colonized and who were colonized at different times in history. But then these colonial people will have to be understood differently, in a sense that they will have to have their own territorial border, internal and external border, can be clearly understood in a way that they are socially and politically subordinate. And there was a theory called salt water theory. It means that those colonies, they are far from the colonial power, can gain a right to self-determination, meaning that African countries who were colonized by Europeans are entitled to have a right to self-determination. And then what are the meanings of right to self-determination in this context? It is about independence. They have the right to claim independence, or they have the right to freely associate with other countries, or they can be integrated with their own colonial power. So these three elements were there when you ask for a right to self-determination within the context of United Nations, meaning that self-determination applies only to non-self-governing territories. So what was the position of indigenous peoples in this context? Because indigenous peoples were not geographically distinct. They don't have internal or external territorial borders to clearly identify their territories. So therefore, it is a complex to talk about a right to self-determination that applies to indigenous people. In other words, actually, if you use this model, then indigenous peoples are not entitled to exercise a right to self-determination, because that applies only to non-self-governing territories or trust territories. And this has got reaffirmation also in another UN resolution adopted by the General Assembly in 1970, which has resulted in a declaration, the Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, meaning that territorial integrity has to be protected, has to be respected, and indigenous peoples territory, which is connected to the national territory, is kind of non-violable. Yeah. So which means that indigenous people cannot claim the same right to self-determination as it applies to non-self-governing territory. Then what was it, the self-determination that applies to indigenous people? So we look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, in particular Article 3, which says that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. This is actually the same article you find in two covenants: the covenants on international covenants on civil and political rights, and International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Right. It is called Common Article 1. In both covenants, they use the same language. Only exception is that in those covenants, in Article 1, this is all peoples have the right to self-determination. And in Article 3 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, it says indigenous peoples. But then there was a clarification given also in Article 4 that self-determination in this context mean autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs. So that gives the indigenous people a right to exercise their self-determination internally, meaning that they have to gain some form of autonomy and self-governance from their own national government. And that was also because, as I said, that self-determination for indigenous people has to respect the territorial integrity. Otherwise, it goes against the provision of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter. And that there you get the reaffirmation also from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. In particular, Article 46, Paragraph 1, which says that nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying any activity or to perform any act contrary to the Charter of the United Nations. So when United Nations Charter's provisions are respected, it means that indigenous peoples do not have right to exercise self-determination as it understood in the context of giving independence to non-self-governing territories. They don't have right to choose whether they would like to have their own state, or they would like to associate with other state, or they integrate within their own national state. So that kind of self-determination does not apply to indigenous people. Then what kind of self-determination do we talk about when we refer to indigenous people? Well, most scholars talk about, they kind of differentiate external dimension of self-determination and internal dimension of self-determination. And in a very straightforward way, external dimension of self-determination refers to a right to claim, for example, statehood, to secede from the existing state. And internal meaning that indigenous people have autonomy or self-governance, or they negotiate with their own national government and receive autonomy on some of the matters to exercise their own matters by their own way without strong influence from the national government. In that way, internal self-determination is interpreted. So therefore, external right to self-determination does not apply to indigenous people. That was the mainstream idea. But I have some different opinion in this regard, because I try to reconceptualize a right to self-determination differently in present-day context. Before I talk about that, let me just tell you that why indigenous people would need to have the right to self-determination. As I said, that they have been also colonized at different times in history, but they have their own identity. They have their own established identity by virtue of having their own culture, own traditional way of life, own belief system, own knowledge system. So when there is an established identity, and at the same time, most indigenous peoples, they have their own institutions. So they control, for example, their traditional knowledge system. They control their, they have capacity to control their education system, their religious institutions, their customary norms, customary legal norms in their own way. So that gives them kind of agency. And when they have this established identity and this effective agency, then they could exercise a right to self-determination. And then I talk about right to self-determination from different perspectives. It does not necessarily have to be a right claiming for independence. It has to have some kind of procedural elements, because as I said in the beginning that we have enough of standards, enough of norms. Now we need to see how these norms are translated into practice. And to translate them into practice, I would suggest that indigenous people have both internal and external right to self-determination. And how? So internally, as we said, that human rights norms give clear indication that indigenous people can exercise some of their rights in regard to, for example, in regard to matters that are of their own and that are of their own concerns. So any kind of activities within the land on which they live has to be given some kind of attention from the principles that we have developed so far. So one of those principles is called free, prior, and informed consent. In the United Nations Declaration on the rights of on the rights of indigenous people, at least in 5 places we will find the reference of free, prior, and informed consent. It means that any kind of developmental activities that are taken place on indigenous people's land has to be agreed upon with indigenous peoples themselves, with their own respective institutions. In ILO convention, as I referred to earlier, it was about consultation and participation. But then UN declaration clearly says that that's not enough. Consultation meaning that you consult with indigenous people, and participation means that you invite them to decision-making process, but then you don't have informed consent, meaning that you have to understand the consequences and you have to consent. In other words, indigenous people do have a veto right. And that's how you exercise a right to self-determination in internal context. For example, within national legal system, you can integrate environmental impact assessment or human rights impact assessment or social license to operate. So these are the terminologies you use where you invite indigenous people to take part when it is about their matters, or when the activities or when the actions affect indigenous people's rights, and they have the clear clear right to participate in those kind of procedures. In that way, you exercise a right to self-determination, and you get confirmation of this kind of elements in human rights jurisprudence. At least there are 2 cases I can refer to in this context here. One is Saramacca people versus Suriname, a South American case where Inter-American Court of Human Rights clearly referred to Article 32 of UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, saying that even though UN Declaration was not binding, but within national legal system, national judicial system, they gave effect of the principles of UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, saying that there has to be free, prior, and informed consent before the activities take place with indigenous people, and indigenous people exercise right to self-determination this way. And also in Human Rights Committee is Angela Puma versus Peru case in 2009. In that case, Human Rights Committee clearly says that state was obliged to have free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous people. So you see how internally a right to self-determination can be exercised when it comes about the rights of indigenous people. Then how about the external dimension of exercising right to self-determination? Well, there are several examples I can just give you here. International legal process now include indigenous people as actors in many different ways. Of course, it's not kind of very clear-cut case, but in many different ways. For example, international climate change negotiation, international climate change lawmaking process that include indigenous people in the way that indigenous people can participate in the process through their own organization. So there is an organization called International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. It's an Indigenous Peoples Caucus where indigenous people from different countries represent, and they raise their issue, and they also bring their own knowledge system that they have been using for thousands of years in regard to environmental management. And those knowledge systems have been having huge importance in lawmaking process, and that are recognized. So that is one way of having or exercising a right to self-determination in external context. Also, I refer to Article 8J. There was a working group composed of indigenous people as well to consider different elements of Article 8J of Biodiversity Convention. And since 2014, I'm sorry, since 2014, there was United Nations Environmental Assembly that are being held in Nairobi in Kenya after every 2 years. So first one was in 2014, and then after I think the fourth one will be convened next year. So there also indigenous peoples, for indigenous peoples to recognize their knowledge system, there is an indigenous peoples focal point established. And this through this focal point, indigenous people participate in environmental lawmaking process or environmental decision-making process, or process that might lead to promote new norms to integrate in environmental law. So, and then there are other efforts. Since I belong to here in one of the Arctic countries, and I have been doing a lot of research on Arctic issues. So I would also refer here, the Arctic Council is an institution of the Arctic states, all 8 Arctic states. In most of these Arctic countries, you see indigenous peoples and their participation. So Arctic Council is an intergovernmental forum represented by 8 Arctic countries, but it has a special arrangement where, indigenous, there are 6 indigenous peoples organizations from all across the Arctic. So they participate in the decision making. They sit with the state actor and participate in the decision-making process in international context. So by participating in this international process, they also exercise their right to self-determination because their issues were kind of clearly communicated with the states. And in fact, no decisions are taken without having approval from the indigenous peoples organizations. And in Finland, Sweden, and Norway, as I said, that there are Sami indigenous people living in these 3 countries. They have their own institutions called Sami parliaments. In each of these countries, they have Sami parliaments. So there are 3 Sami parliaments, and they also take part in lawmaking process. For example, Nordic Sami Convention is being adopted by these 3 countries. And when negotiation is taking place, there are equal number of representations from these Sami parliaments, along with foreign ministry representatives from the national actors. So it means that in this way also they perform a right to self-determination that is exercised externally. So all what I wanted to deliver here is that indigenous peoples do have right to self-determination, both externally and internally, but you have to figure out how this right is exercised. And for what reason these rights are exercised. And these rights are exercised to promote democratic governance, both in national context as well as in international context. That being said, I thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, Professor Hossain, for your enlightening and very interesting lecture. I must say that this has not only made us interested about the rights which are following all over the world, but it has gained some attention of the students also, because they should know what is the right of self-determination, which could be effective for the indigenous people all over the world. So we will discuss the issue and we will take up some questions. I think it will be better if we take up some questions after both the lectures.
Yes,
So,
yes.
okay. I will request all the participants to list up your questions and keep it up with you, and we'll discuss after the lecture of Professor Nestor Castro. So now I would like to request Miss Shashwati Roy, one of the eminent teachers of our department. She is specialized in archaeological anthropology, and she is teaching in Mrinalini Datta Mahavidyapith since long. So I will now request Shashwati to introduce Professor Castro with your delightful words.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session, Indigenous Rights, Issues and Challenges, organized by Department of Anthropology. Me,
Shashwati, can you speak aloud?
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session, Indigenous Rights, Issues and Challenges, organized by Department of Anthropology. Me, Shashwati Roy, has got the opportunity to introduce our eminent speaker, Dr. Nestor Castro. Dr. Castro is...
Can you hear? I can't hear anything. Shumon, can you hear?
Very little, I think. Is there any, I think there's some problem in the microphone, Shashwati. Can you realize the microphone? I think there's some misconnections of microphone.
Okay. Here. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to today's session, Indigenous Rights, Issues and Challenges, organized by Department of Anthropology. Me, Shashwati Roy, has got the opportunity to introduce our eminent speaker, Dr. Nestor Castro. Dr. Nestor Castro is Professor of Anthropology at University of Philippines, Diliman, specializing in cultural anthropology. His expertise includes ethnicity and indigenous peoples issues, environmental and social impact assessment, and cultural heritage management. His works have been published in notable journals such as Lee Thames Moderns, New Asian Visions Colloquium, The New Horizon of Contemporary Sociological Theory, Philippine Social Sciences Review, Casarillan and Diliman Review. Dr. Castro did field research in several indigenous communities in the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, New Caledonia, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. His master's thesis was on the communist movement in the Cordillera region of northern Philippines, while his PhD dissertation was on the politics of ethnic identity among the Kalinga indigenous people of the Philippines. Dr. Castro served as chair of the Anthropology Department, Associate Dean of the Community Affairs of UP Diliman. He also served as the Vice Chairman of the Anthropological Association of the Philippines, Vice Chairman of the National Research Council of the Philippines, Social Sciences Division, and Southeast Asian representative of the International Commission for Rights of the Aboriginal People, and President of the International Federation of Social Sciences Organization. At present, Dr. Castro is President of the International Council of Museums, Philippines, Vice President of the Pi Gamma Mu International Honor Society in the Social Sciences, Philippines, Alpha Chapter, and Regent of the Pasig City University. Aside from teaching and research, Dr. Castro regularly appears on Philippine television as resource person on Philippine culture. Now may I invite our eminent Professor Dr. Nestor Castro to enlighten his topic and enrich us. He is going to deliver a very informative lecture on the indigenous peoples of Southeast Asia, issues and challenges. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Sashwati. Good evening to everyone. Good evening because here in the Philippines, it's already evening. So good afternoon to those from India and other parts of the world. So thank you very much to Dr. Schumann, to Dr. Mitali for inviting me to this international webinar. I would also like to greet the faculty and students of the Department of Anthropology of Mrinalini Datta Mahavidyapith. Sorry, I can't pronounce it correctly.
You pronounce absolutely correct, sir.
But very, very slowly.
No,
Okay. So
nice, right.
the lecture of Dr. Kamrul Hossain was very enlightening because it set the tone of what I'm going to discuss. So he discussed about the global indigenous peoples issues, uh, mainly on indigenous peoples' rights. And I will now focus on indigenous peoples of Southeast Asia, the region where I'm coming from. So let me share my screen first. Now, where's that? Okay. Okay, so my topic, I hope you can see my screen, Indigenous Peoples of Southeast Asia, Issues and Challenges. Okay, I have two objectives in this sharing. I would like to call it sharing so that you are familiarized with the situation in Southeast Asia. First is to identify who indigenous peoples are in general, but Dr. Kamrul has already done that. But in particular in Southeast Asia, who are the indigenous peoples? Secondly, to identify key issues and challenges affecting indigenous peoples in the Southeast Asian region. So for those who are not familiar with Southeast Asia, so this is east of South Asia. So it is basically divided into mainland Southeast Asia and insular Southeast Asia. So mainland Asia, Southeast Asia consists of the countries such as Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and the Malay Peninsula, which is part of Malaysia. And insular Southeast Asia includes the Philippines, Indonesia, the eastern part of Malaysia, and East Timor. Of course, this is practically the map of the ASEAN region, the countries comprising the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. If I will use a cultural definition of Southeast Asia, I may even go wider than this to include Taiwan, because the indigenous peoples of Taiwan are very much related to the indigenous peoples of the Philippines and other parts of the region. But I won't be discussing about Taiwan in this lecture. So Southeast Asia is a very ethnically diverse region, as you can see in these pictures. They wear different attires. They wear physically. Some of them are darker and shorter than others. They would have different cultures and traditions, and there are many factors for this variability ethnically. Of course, even modern day Southeast Asia is very diverse. There are big and huge countries such as Indonesia, which has 3 time zones, and very small ones such as Brunei and East Timor, which is not listed in that list. Some are richer than others. And of course, if we go to pre-modern Southeast Asia, of course, these national boundaries won't be there. It is largely a product of the colonial history of Southeast Asia. Some countries have been colonized by the French, such as Indochina, consisting of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Some countries have been occupied by the British, such as Malaysia and Singapore, which was then part of the Malay Peninsula. Some countries have been colonized by Spain and America, such as the Philippines. And some have not been formally colonized, such as Thailand, which kept its uh, distinct traditional characteristic because it was kept as a buffer country between the French Indochina and the British Myanmar. Okay, I failed to mention Burma, now called Myanmar. So if we are going to talk about indigenous peoples as representing a carryover of pro-modern Southeast Asia, the boundaries will not be the same. There are indigenous peoples who are part of different countries within this region, as I shall point to you later. Okay, so here you can see the majority populations of Southeast Asia, like Brunei, uh, the majority of which are racially called Malay, consisting of 64%, followed by the Chinese, who are non-indigenous to Brunei. So where are the remaining percent? And basically, that will be the indigenous people of Brunei. Okay, I won't be discussing each one of this because we will be going into so many details. But as was mentioned a while ago by Dr. Kamrul, so in the past, the one categorization used was uh, ethnic minorities. So indigenous peoples are the ethnic minorities of these countries. But that term isn't too precise because some of these ethnic minorities, such as the Chinese, the Indians, the Tamil, are not indigenous to this region, but were only brought in or migrated into this region. So we're talking about the original peoples of this area. The Philippines is quite unique because there is not one ethnic group that is dominant in the country. So the biggest will be the Tagalog. That's where I came from. This is the ethnic group that is within the National Capital Region. This is Metro Manila. But if you add Tagalog, Cebuano, all the way to Pangasinan, they make up the bigger majority of the population, and they would have certain characteristics that are shared, and the remaining indigenous peoples will have differences from this majority population, mainly because they have kept their traditional indigenous practices despite colonialization. So I know the definition of indigenous peoples has already been given, at least from UN or international agencies. So as an anthropologist, and many of us here are anthropology professors and students, so this definition comes from Konrad Kotak, uh, using his textbook in general anthropology. So he defined indigenous peoples as the original inhabitants of particular territories. So it may be equivalent to the Aborigines, as in the case of Australia. Uh, he further continued that indigenous peoples are often descendants of tribes people who live on as culturally distinct colonized peoples, many of whom aspire autonomy. So because we already have nation states in the world, in Southeast Asia, the nation states are more or less defined. Of course, there would be areas of contention, but within these nation states, there will be original inhabitants that have remained distinct culturally from the rest due to colonization, and they aspire self-determination in the form of autonomy. So this comes from Kotak. But of course, that is an academic definition, and we will have some sort of legal definitions or broadly accepted by legal entities. So this has already been mentioned. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues used several criteria, primarily self-identification, if people feel that they are distinct from the rest, and they are recognized by neighboring groups as distinct from them, then they are an indigenous community. They have historical continuity with pre-colonial or pre-settler societies. They have a strong link to territories and surrounding natural resources. They have distinct social, economic, and political systems. That's an or. So one may be present, the other may be absent. They have distinct language, culture, and beliefs. They form non-dominant groups of society. So this is very important, especially when applied to Southeast Asia. So we are not referring to those who are in the majority or who have the political and economic power in these countries. Because many Southeast Asian nations will say, but we are all indigenous. We are not migrants to these areas. We have been here prior to colonization by Western powers. But of course, when we talk about indigenous peoples, we talk about non-dominant groups. And they resolve to maintain and reproduce ancestral environments and systems which, according to studies of anthropologists, are more sustainable practices because they recognize uh, uh, an ecosystems approach in the relationship between flora, fauna, and humans. Now, one other agency is the World Bank, and other multilateral agencies. The Asian Development Bank will have another definition. The International Finance Corporation, although allied with the World Bank, will have somewhat a different definition. So I won't go into the differences among these definitions, but I'm citing the World Bank definition because it has been applied when uh, countries go into environmental and social impact assessments, when they establish development projects and request or apply for funds from the World Bank, because they are World Bank member countries, and World Bank will insist you should apply the requirement for free and prior informed consent, which has been discussed a while ago. So in what context is this applicable? So according to the World Bank, indigenous peoples refer to distinct, vulnerable social and cultural groups possessing the following characteristics in varying degrees. So some of these in bullets may be very apparent, but some may not be as prominent now than it was in the past. So they have self-identification and identification by others. So it's not a one-way identification. You cannot say, I belong to an IP community or in an indigenous community, but no one agrees that you believe that you belong to that community. So it should be mutual recognition. Second, collective attachment to land and natural resources. Third, they have customary cultural, economic, social, or political institutions that are separate from those of dominant society, and culture. So in Southeast Asia, there would be a variation of these various customary cultural, economic, social, and political institutions. So some will be in the form of sultanates, basically Islamic sultanates. Some will be in the form of chiefdoms. Some will be hunting and gathering societies. So these differences should also be looked at and taken into consideration. And of course, another very important consideration is the possession of an indigenous language, because we believe as anthropologists that language is the soul of a culture. Therefore, it carries with it the belief systems, the traditions, the values, etc. of that population. Now, because I come from the Philippines, I will give many examples coming from the Philippines, but also because within Southeast Asia, it is probably the Philippines only that has a legally defined definition of who indigenous peoples are. The Philippines has ratified Republic Act number 8371, otherwise known as the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997. So basically, it is more or less similar to what has been already discussed. So I won't, so self-ascription and ascription by others, comparing that to self-identification, identification by others. They have claims of ownership since time immemorial, occupied, possessed, and utilized ancestral territories. So they have traditional territories. So they may not have papers to prove that they own these territories, but since they could recall, this is the legal definition in the Philippines of since time memorial, as far as they could recall, their ancestors have stayed in these territories. Sharing common bonds of language, that is very much easy to understand. And I think this is a very important criterion. Through resistance to political, social, and cultural inroads of colonization, non-indigenous religions and cultures, they became historically differentiated from the majority of Filipinos. So our law recognizes, yes, majority of Filipinos in the Philippines are indeed indigenous to the Philippines, They are originally from the Philippines, but because of colonization, the majority, such as the Tagalogs, have been colonized and therefore adopted Christianity, adopted Western culture and traditions, while the rest have maintained their indigenous practices. So this is an important criterion when applied to the Philippines. Elsewhere in the region, it is not as clear, and there have been many terminologies that are being used with varying applications of these terminologies. So the terms that are being used elsewhere in the region, in Indonesia, they refer to adat communities. Adat refers to customary law. It is not based on Sharia law, but these are the laws of the communities even before the coming of Islam into Indonesia. So which communities still practice these customary laws? So this is the criterion used in Indonesia. Let me mention that Indonesia doesn't want to use the term indigenous people or indigenous peoples because they would argue we are all indigenous here in Indonesia. So they prefer to use this term. So in Cambodia, the term is Chuntiat, which is referring to ethnic communities. A very common term that has been used and still used by some is ethnic minorities. But as I mentioned, we have to differentiate those that are not indigenous to the area, but migrated into the region, but because their population is smaller, therefore they are minorities. So they are not indigenous people to the area. In mainland Southeast Asia, most particularly in Vietnam and in Thailand, they mention the term hill tribes. Of course, in Vietnam, during the time of French occupation, they are referred to as the montagnards. So they are the mountain peoples, as opposed to the majority that are agricultural communities found in lowland areas of this region. In the Malay Peninsula, they use the term Orang Asli, which literally means original people. So they are not Malay because, of course, if we trace the origin of the Malays, they came not from Malaysia, but from Sumatra in Indonesia. So the Orang Asli are the original people of the Malay Peninsula. Now, what is problematic in Malaysia? So they have this category for the Malay Peninsula, but when they apply it to eastern part of Malaysia, particularly Sabah and Sarawak states, they don't use the term Orang Asli because there would be various ethnic groups in the region. In Thailand, one term used for hunters and gatherers is Sakai, which originally meant slave and was a derogatory term not acceptable to indigenous people. So because Southeast Asia is a very diverse region, mainly because of its geographic character. So there are mountains, there are islands, like Indonesia and the Philippines are both archipelagos. So within different islands, there would be different ethnic groups as well as linguistic groups that have emerged and are original to these areas. So there would be hundreds of indigenous groups or even thousands within Southeast Asia. So I could not discuss all of them. Let me highlight some more than others. As I mentioned, this is a sharing, so I would like to just give examples. Okay. Let me first go to common indigenous. So in the Philippines, you will see that Negrito populations are spread out in the archipelago. They look similar phenotypically, but interestingly, when we talk about their language, they will have different languages. Their languages are not intelligible with one another. Actually, their languages today are very much similar to the languages of their neighboring groups, who are non-Negrito. So many anthropologists believe that actually the earliest form of adaptive mechanism that they acquired in order to survive is to borrow the languages of neighboring groups. So they have lost their original non-Austronesian languages. Interestingly, one of these groups, which is the Agta, located in northeastern Luzon, is still a hunting-gathering society, unlike the others that are now sedentary. So this is of interest to anthropologists because we know that in the prehistoric past, humans of the world were primarily hunters and gatherers. And ethnoarchaeologists in particular are very much interested in studying hunting and gathering societies that still exist in the world today so that we understand how it was in the prehistoric past. Another group of indigenous people that are spread in Southeast Asia, mainly in insular Southeast Asia, are the Bajau people found in the borders of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. The Bajau are seafaring peoples. So some of them live in houseboats. Others live in houses raised on stilts, such as the one you see at the back. But these stilts are established on top of coral reefs. So they move about from place to place. Interestingly, based on their folklore, they believe that they originated from Malacca in Malaysia. Now, they lived in boats. One night, according to their folklore or their folk stories, they rested. They tied their boats on a piece of rock protruding out of the sea. But when they woke up in the morning, they were in another place because it wasn't a rock, but a giant sea turtle. So that is their story of how they moved about. So the Bajau, they are called by other names in the region. They are also called Sama in southern Philippines. They are also called Sama Dilaut, meaning Sama of the seas, as opposed to the Sama that live on land. The Bajau may have different spellings, but they share a common language and they move about these territories even without passports and visas. So they are marginalized in these three countries. Although they would say that they are Muslims, even among Muslim ethnic groups, they are very much discriminated because they are branded as being pagans, because they still practice, together with Islam, certain animistic practices. So you could just imagine some of the issues confronted by both the Negritos that are nomadic and the Bajau, also nomadic, one nomadic on land, this one nomadic on sea. So many of them, we don't have an actual count or census because they move about. Secondly, in terms of establishing government services such as schools. So you establish a school in certain Bajau territories. The children go to school, but later on they don't finish school because they have moved elsewhere. As I mentioned, in Indochina as well as in Thailand, a common term will be, as well as in Myanmar, a common term that is used is hill tribes because they live in the hills. And many of them are tourist destinations within this region. The picture on the left is in Sapa in northern Thailand. So it's a tourist destination for trekkers, backpackers, mountain climbers. The other one on the right is the Palong of Chiang Mai, Thailand. Although in Thailand, they would claim that they are not indigenous to Thailand, but they are originally from Myanmar who have moved into Thailand. So again, uh, so there are issues pertaining to tourism and how tourism has affected their cultures. There is the issue of migration, such as, are they original Thai citizens? If not, therefore don't have benefits of being Thai. So these are some of the issues confronted by these peoples. Of course, in the historical past, such as during the Vietnam War, uh, the United States has capitalized on these differences of hill tribes by arming them and fighting Vietnamese liberation forces. So the issue of divide and rule has been an issue for many of these hill tribes. Clamor for self-determination. Some groups not just fighting for autonomy, but going into armed confrontation with the government of Indonesia in order to establish an independent Papuan state. So again, that would be an issue that is common in the region. Now, of course, okay, in the Philippines, although the law, which is the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, does not recognize, ironically, the Bangsamoro of southern Philippines. They are Muslim groups in southern Philippines, consisting of these different ethnic groups. They will have different languages. What is common is that all of them have been Islamized when Islam came to the Philippines during the 15th century. Now, why have I included this slide? Because in the Philippines, although I said that we have a law that recognizes indigenous peoples, that law does not recognize the Bangsamoro as indigenous people because according to lawmakers, Islam is not indigenous to the Philippines. It has just been introduced to the Philippines. But when we talk about pre-colonial Philippines, practically the entire Philippines, from the southern province of Tawi-Tawi all the way to northern Luzon, particularly the province of Pangasinan, have been Islamized prior to the coming of the Spanish. Even Manila was a Islamic city prior to the coming of the Spanish. So why are they excluded? And because of that exclusion, they do not, uh, they are, uh, do not, uh, benefit from the rights accorded by that law. Okay, so just some data on the Bangsamoro Philippines. They have been Islamized. The earliest sultanate in the Philippines was established in 1450 in Sulu. And you will still see in southern China descendants of the Sulu chieftain that visited China prior to the advent of Western colonization. And many Muslim groups in southern China are very much related to Muslims in southern Philippines. There was a very strong secessionist movement in the past calling for the establishment of a separate Bangsamoro Republic. Bangsa, by the way, means nation. At present, there is a Bangsamoro autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao, but this is an autonomous setup within the Philippine state and not a totally independent nation. Now, let me go to, as I mentioned, I won't go into very distinct and particular indigenous group within the region. I know in our participants here, I also saw Dr. Montri of Thailand, so maybe later during the open forum, he could share to us more about the situation in Thailand. But here are some common issues. The non-recognition as indigenous peoples by the state, and therefore there is no recognition of their rights as indigenous peoples. So, unlike the Philippines, the rest of Southeast Asia has no law regarding indigenous peoples' rights. Although some other countries have adopted the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but when they apply it to their countries, they would say, oh, but that is a different case. This is indigenous, this is not. Okay. Another issue will be commercialization of their culture, especially because of tourism. So, of course, Southeast Asia is generally a tourist destination, especially for Westerners who want to see the exotic, who want to see the Oriental. And therefore, many of Southeast Asian states have capitalized on this by quote unquote preserving the culture of indigenous peoples. But some issues remain. Like, for example, I've heard among indigenous people of the Philippines saying, why do you want us to remain traditional when you have changed? So why are you prohibiting us? So that violates the right to self-determination. It is actually the indigenous people who have the right to say what they want to maintain and what they want to change. Of course, a lot has changed in their cultures because of the coming in of the money system. Many of their traditional products are mainly produced for the tourist market, even if traditionally they were produced for ritual purposes. So, for example, certain death blankets are for sale for tourists because they look nice, but actually they should only be worn by the dead in a death ritual. Or certain dances are performed for the delight of tourists, even if originally they were only for ritual purposes. The third issue is conversion into non-indigenous religions. So many of the indigenous peoples have been converted into Christianity or Islam, depending on what is the dominant religion in that particular area of Southeast Asia. Some of these conversions were by force. Others, they were co-opted because people saw that there would be some benefits in being converted. For example, in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in the Philippines, so the Bangsamoro are the dominant group there. There are Muslims. But within that territory, there are indigenous people who are animists. But those groups, such as the Teduray, they recognize, but if we don't become Muslim, probably we will be marginalized in this region. So it would be better to be converted. So these are some of the issues. Loss of indigenous languages, some of them by outright imposition. I remember even when I was a child, although Tagalog is a majority group in the Philippines, when I was a child in the 1960s and 1970s, in the school, we were disallowed into using our native language. We were forced into using English. And for every word that is spoken that is Tagalog, you are fined for it. You have to pay something to the school. So this is a form of colonial imposition that has been continued by the so-called independent states of Southeast Asia. Some of the loss of indigenous languages is because of contact with dominant groups, and indigenous people have adopted the languages of neighboring groups. Then the displacement from their traditional territories in order to pave way for development. So because indigenous peoples inhabit resource-rich areas, such as mountainous areas, maritime communities, forests, where the resources are, such as gold, copper, and other minerals, logging and lumber products, timber, fish, and other aquatic resources. So because the national state sees there is a priority to develop these resource-rich areas so that everyone in the nation state will benefit from it, the indigenous peoples are asked to sacrifice in the name of the broader majority. Okay. Of course, that was before the concept of free and prior informed consent was being applied by some states and some funding agencies. But even that system can be bastardized or co-opted. Later, I can discuss it during the open forum. So in the Philippines, for example, you will see here a map of the Philippines. We are an archipelago of 7,500 islands. And to the left and the right of the map, listed there are various groups of indigenous peoples whose languages are endangered, whether threatened, shifting, moribund, nearly extinct, dormant, or actually extinct. These are linguistic categories. Again, I won't go into that, but all of them are endangered languages. Okay, to continue with common issues and problems, this is the last slide for common issues and problems. Cases of ethnic cleansing and genocide, such as the most famous one, of course, an issue will be the Rohingya of Myanmar. Although people from Myanmar will say, but they are not indigenous to Myanmar. They came from Bangladesh and only migrated into Myanmar. So this is a bone of contention, but definitely there are violations of human rights of the Rohingya people, mainly coming from the armed forces of Myanmar. Of course, the dominant population of Myanmar is Buddhist, while the Rohingya are Muslims. So a while ago, when I presented the dominant ethnic groups in Southeast Asia, because they are the dominant, they will always impose their culture on the rest of society. For example, majority of Filipinos, about 83%, are Roman Catholics. Therefore, it is always said, but of course, this is a myth, that the Philippines is a Catholic country, it's a Christian country. But what does it mean if you say that? Does it mean that if you are non-Catholic, therefore you are not a Filipino? So in Thailand, they will say to be Thai is to be a Buddhist. So if you belong to an indigenous community in Thailand that is not Buddhist, does it mean you're not Thai? Or in Malaysia and in Brunei, they say to be a Malaysian, you have to be Malay and you have to be Muslim. So what about the Orang Asli who are not Malay, don't speak Malay, and are not Muslim? So these are some of the problems. Militarization of their ancestral territories due primarily to conflict between the state military forces and armed rebel groups. So within various parts of Southeast Asia, either existing today or sometime in the past, there have been secessionist movements coming from indigenous peoples that want to establish their own states. So for example, in Papua of Indonesia, there is the OPM, the Organisasi Papua Merdeka, or the Free Papua Movement, that have taken arms against the government. In southern Philippines, there are Moro rebels wanting to establish an independent Bangsamoro state. They have taken arms. In the past, in southern Thailand, there was a Patani United Liberation Organization wanting to separate Patani region from Thailand and establish a Muslim state in the region. But now it's not as strong anymore in that region. So in these areas, because of the presence of such armed movements, militarization, mainly coming from the nation state, has happened, and the indigenous people have been caught in the crossfire. So they either have to play along with the state or play along with the armed rebel groups in order to survive. Now, when these two groups come face to face, they are caught in the middle and become victims of armed conflicts. Then lastly is the right to self-determination is not recognized, at least as described by Dr. Kumar in terms of the external definition. You cannot secede from our nation states. You only have the option to be an autonomous region within our nation state. So these are some of the common problems and issues happening in the region right now. So I've discussed Rohingya. This is my last slide. So what are the challenges? What can be done? One challenge is how to build a peaceful, multi-ethnic Southeast Asia or multi-ethnic communities in Southeast Asia. Ethnic diversity is a given in Southeast Asia. But how can people live peacefully in the region, respecting one another in the region? The second, so I envy the Arctic region. They have this network of indigenous peoples. In Southeast Asia, there is no regional block of indigenous peoples movements. Yes, they will have links with one another. That's good. They share information with one another, but there's no ASEAN network of indigenous peoples movements. Even in my home country of the Philippines, indigenous peoples are divided from one another because they belong to different organizations. And sometimes there is infighting even among these different organizations. Some of the reasons are because of influences of external groups, but some of the differences also are because of geographic spread. Now, I would like to see that in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, there is a formal recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples within the region. This is still something that has to be worked on by advocates of indigenous peoples' rights in Southeast Asia. And I hope anthropologists in the region uh, take hand in hand together in advocating these rights. Here are my concluding remarks. Reflecting as an anthropologist or as an academic, there is an urgent need to study and document the indigenous cultures of Southeast Asia before they change drastically due to acculturation and modernization processes. Of course, that is already taking place, but it will definitely intensify. So let us do research as anthropologists. It is important to make the public aware about the richness of indigenous culture and to value cultural diversity. So it is our tasks as anthropologists to share to the public about the notions and concepts of cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, and cultural competence. Anthropologists act as culture brokers between the wider public and indigenous peoples or other marginalized stakeholder groups. We are able to cross the boundaries of these two groups, and therefore we are in a position to share to the other about how to understand the other. Lastly, because I am in ICOM, in the International Council of Museums, while heritage preservation is indeed important, it is the right of indigenous peoples to determine which aspects of their culture they would want to preserve and which ones they would want to change. We do not impose on them what to preserve and what to change. If we believe in the right to self-determination, it is really up to them, of course, based on informed consent. We share to them the options, but they ultimately decide. So this is all. Thank you very much. I know there's an open forum, but if you want to send me an email, my email is mtcastro1@up.edu.ph. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for your gripping lecture. We could not move from in front of this laptop because it was very much interesting, and you have shown some rare pictures also. I think it has encouraged our students also. So before opening the floor for discussion, I would like.
Suchishmita,
Yes.
I think before going to the discussion, at first you should give the chance to our students specifically for their questions, right? So then we will discuss more detail if time will permit.
Okay, sure. So some of our students are asking some of the questions. One of our student, first semester student, Jishu, he asked two pertinent question. One is, what does it mean for churches to affirm the rights of indigenous people to their spiritual tradition? That means, what is the role of the church to retain the tradition of the indigenous people? I think both of you can react to this question, Professor Hossain and Professor Castro. So I will take up the answer from Professor Hossain first, then from Professor Castro.
Well, thank you for the question. Well, I don't have much idea about the legal role that church is playing in regard to indigenous people. Of course, they are a voluntary organization and they are working for the well-being of the communities, including indigenous peoples. But in the context of rights, we are referring to states as the duty bearer and indigenous peoples as the right holders. So it is the duty of the state to provide specific rights as guaranteed in international legal documents, including in human rights instruments for the indigenous people. Probably the role of church is to facilitate indigenous people to strengthen their position against the state if the state is in violation of providing the rights that are eligible to the indigenous people. So I'm not sure if I have answered the question, but that was what I thought about this question.
Unmute, Sujishmita. Yes, I think now the Professor
Yes,
Nestor.
Professor Castro, please. Yes.
Okay. Of course, different churches and different religious groups will also have different orientations. They do not belong to the same persuasion. As I mentioned, some groups do not recognize indigenous, some church groups do not recognize indigenous people's rights themselves because they impose on them the religion that they believe the indigenous peoples should be converted into. But on the other hand, some church groups are very progressive, very open-minded. I agree to what Dr. Hossain has mentioned. They should be supportive of initiatives coming from indigenous peoples, especially when the rights of indigenous peoples are being violated by the state. I could cite examples from the Philippines. I'm not as familiar with other countries in Southeast Asia. But in the Philippines, the church, this is the Catholic Church, has mainly become a refuge of indigenous people's movements because there are instances when certain indigenous schools have been destroyed by the national state because they think that these indigenous schools perpetuate an anti-state ideology, so they have been destroyed. Many of indigenous leaders have been arrested and imprisoned. So the Catholic Church in many areas in the provinces of the Philippines has become a refuge. So there is a movement of indigenous people outside of their territories. They took sanctuaries in these churches. So I think that will be something that should be done by other groups. It doesn't have to be as radical as that. It should be supportive of indigenous people's initiatives, right to education, right to livelihood, right to their own religion, etc., etc.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Castro. Related to this same issue, since we are talking about religion, I have one question. You were talking about Bangsamaro tribe who have taken up Islam. Are they traditionally taking up Islam, or are they have converted to Islam?
Traditionally, the Bangsamoro are already Muslim Filipinos. Islam has reached the Philippines during the 15th century. And it is not just them, but including people in Manila during that time, adhered to Islam. At least the chiefs, not everyone, the chiefs adhered to Islam in Luzon Island where Manila was. But when Spain colonized the Philippines in the 16th century, of course, Catholicism was imposed and Spain declared war against the Muslims. This is called in our history as Moro Wars. So right now, the Muslims are the minority in the Philippines. So they are now in the southernmost part of the region. And I would say that they are a very peaceful people. If we have problems of Islamic fundamentalism, it mainly comes from those who have been converted into Islam than those who were traditionally Muslim to begin with prior to colonization. This is to explain who the Bangsamoro is.
Thank you so much. Another question asked by Jishu, the same student, regarding UN declaration. Probably this is to Professor Hossain sir. He's asking whether declaration, this UN committee can mend the relationship between indigenous people and the settlers of a particular area. Whether there is any role of the UN to intervene into the relationship between the two.
If we take United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, so it is a declaration signed by states. By signing the declaration, states committed that they will comply with the provisions of the declaration. Having said that, I would also refer to the fact that this declaration means that declaration is not legally binding. It's like kind of soft regulation or soft law, meaning that declaration has normative force. So states will not clearly violate the law, international law, if they do not recognize or comply with some of the provisions of the declaration. But then, according to some authors, the UN declaration has achieved the status of customary international law because it has been signed by or approved by almost all the states of the world. So when in 2007 declaration was adopted, only 4 countries voted against the declaration. And these 4 countries are United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. But later, all these 4 countries again came and then they approved the declaration. So it has universal kind of recognition. In that context, declaration gives more moral force to all the states to comply with the provisions of the declaration. But as I said, that United Nations does have, of course, does have role, because in my presentation, as I was talking about United Nations Permanent Forum, those who were, attending in different UN forums and raising the issues how declaration is implemented in each of the countries and what were the obstacles and how these obstacles could be overcome. And then the same thing is also being done by UN Special Rapporteur. So it means that, there are processes, and that processes influence implementation of the declaration, and of course states are kind of, states normally don't like to be seen as kind of bad states. So where they have indigenous people, they try to follow the rules. But shortly, directly to answer this question, there is no clear legal mechanism when you talk about implementation of UN declaration. But then, as I said, that states are also parties to those human rights treaties, civil and political rights, Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Even though those treaties talk about individual rights, but then there were some case law jurisprudence where Human Rights Committee, for example, says that a group of people can bring a complaint against the state, targeting or kind of raising the issue that the state is in violation of providing the rights of the indigenous people.
Thank you, Professor Hossain, sir. Another question asked by Nikta, one of our 5th semester student. She was asking whether there is any effect of any effect of colonization on indigenous knowledge. I think both of you can answer this question.
Shall I start?
Yes, please, please.
Okay. So,
well, of course.
Yes, sir. Castro, sir, first. Or
okay.
Castro, sir, yes.
I'll go first. Okay. So basically, if we talk about indigenous knowledge, so this is the knowledge of indigenous people. Knowledge about their agriculture, their education, their environment, their science, their astronomy, etc. But of course, indigenous knowledge is not static. It is not frozen in time, so it changes through time. And because of course, we know culture is dynamic. All cultures are dynamic. So when colonization happened in many of our countries, including Southeast Asia, so there would be also influences on the local knowledge of indigenous people. So some is resistance to the Western knowledge. Another will be an interface, creating a syncretic type of knowledge. So it comes from two sources, colonial and indigenous. Some will be adopting a totally different knowledge. So it definitely affected the indigenous knowledge of people. But generally, when we talk about indigenous peoples in the world in general, in Southeast Asia in particular, many of them have maintained their pre-colonial indigenous knowledge relatively compared to neighboring groups. Because even non-indigenous peoples, some of them have indigenous knowledge as well, but relatively indigenous peoples have maintained many of their indigenous knowledge systems and practices.
Thank you, sir. Hossain, sir, please, your answer.
Yeah, I think the question is answered to some extent, but what I would like to add to this is that mostly indigenous peoples in most of the countries are kind of very much assimilated with the dominant culture. So if I bring reference from the Arctic, in the Arctic, we have around 4 million people. And out of these 4 million people, indigenous people represent only 10%, meaning that only 400,000 people are indigenous people. And many of these people also, they moved out from their homeland areas and they're, having settlements in big cities. And by going to those cities, they also lose, some of the traditional practices, some of the traditional knowledge. And you cannot actually practice those traditional knowledge thing when you are moving out from the region and going to an urban area in complete sense. But those who are living on their traditional land, they still maintain some of the traditional knowledge or traditional knowledge, they have received from their ancestors. And as Professor Castro said, that I totally agree with that, this knowledge is not kind of something very static. So it changes over time with the development that are taking place. For example, now as digitalization is everywhere, and I live on the Arctic region, and here also indigenous people, they are they're kind of using all modern technologies. Just to give you an example from Finland, Sweden, and Norway, where Sami people are living. So they do reindeer heading. Reindeer heading is one of their cultural emblems. So they practice reindeer heading activities, and they used to do reindeer heading by having, you know, traditional ways of doing that. But now they incorporated modern technology. For example, they track reindeer by having GPS collar. So it means that their culture is being integrated, knowledge also is being transformed. But one thing I just would like to refer to here is that you probably know about the Nagoya Protocol, which was adopted in Kyoto, in Nagoya in Japan, not in Kyoto, in Nagoya in Japan in 2010. So there, a provision was adopted about, you know, having community protocols. So the community protocols refer to identification of those knowledge. So each indigenous communities are expected to, you know, kind of record those knowledges in written form, showing that these are the practices they have been doing traditionally, and these are the knowledge they have had, so that they could claim the ownership of the knowledge. Because mostly in indigenous communities, things are going on a very informal level, so they don't have any kind of written document on those knowledge, and that's the problem, that they cannot expect benefit sharing from the use of knowledge by the Western scientists or other business entities. So yes, that was my addition to Professor Castro's comment on this.
Thank you very much for this discussion. I would like to discuss one thing. Many of us, our students, are stuck between the terminological issues. They are asking a kind of question like who are indigenous people, who are tribe, and who are Adivashis. This kind of terminological problems are, it will take time to understand, but you have, Hossain sir has said some of the terminological issues from at the beginning of his lecture, and also Castro sir has also mentioned some of the terminological issues regarding Southeast Asian tribes, so communities in fact. So although it is known that I don't know whether you will agree with me or not, that the term indigenous people is a global term, and everyone is well acquainted with this term indigenous people. But in our country, we specifically talk about tribe, and specifically when we are abide by constitution, we have to tell that scheduled tribe. There is a difference between the terms. And even in Bangladesh, I will like to ask Hossain sir, or you have said that they are now called, as I remember, small ethnic tribal people. But when I was working in Bangladesh, they used to call Adivashi. Don't they use the term Adivashi right now?
Yeah, so indigenous leaders, actually, they would like to be recognized by the term Adivashi, but government is reluctant to, you know, call them Adivashi. Adivashi is translated into indigenous people in that way. So there were a lot of debates and discussion about that. But in our constitution, in Bengali, is called Khudro Mritatik Gosti. But normally we understand them, or we recognize them as tribal people. So yeah, but I really don't know, you know, how to interpret that. But you know that Bangladesh is one of the country that abstained from voting when UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was adopted in 2007. And for India also, I mean, when India signed the declaration, but clearly having a reservation in the declaration saying that after independence, all Indians are regarded as indigenous people.
Yes. This terminological issue will remain controversial till date. It is controversial till date, I think. So these were the questions to be discussed with you, and now I will ask Shumon to comment on something on the issue.
The excellent deliberations by Professor Kamrul Hossain and Professor Nestor Castro. I must congratulate both of them. And I'm very much fortunate that both of them agreed to convey the message of indigenous rights and issues to our students. Students are getting very much benefited by your lectures, and I think they should learn more meticulously regarding the indigenous population in compared to, as I said, that in compared to the Indian scheduled tribal populations. So basically, when we are talking about the Indian indigenous populations, we are considering scheduled tribal population, and most part of our curriculum. So from undergraduate to postgraduate and so on and so forth, we are basically try to understand the nature and different kind of rights and all these things of the Indian context. But now the thing is open to think the students of our institute, specifically for the anthropological students, who can think elaborately what the world are telling regarding the indigenous population in different nations and different states. Now, one of our colleague from political science department, she is senior colleague, Dr. Reena Bosch-Mitro, she asked to Professor Kamrul Hossain that whether the Sami people are the same of the Fino people.
No, Sami people are the indigenous people. They have been living mostly in the northern part of Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and they have been actually pushed, to the far north throughout the history. So Finnish people, originally Finnish people, it is said that Finnish people are called, Finno-Ugric people. So probably they have had roots somewhere in Hungary or some of those kind of places. So they shifted and they moved to north, and then they established their country in Finland. So I don't have actually any clear knowledge about those historical perspectives.
Anyway, it is true that the Sami people, they are quite different. Whether they have different language with the Finno people?
They have different language. They have 11 different languages.
Okay. Thank you. So my next question to Professor Kamrul Hossain, that you are telling that self-determinism. So self-determinations, internal self-determinations and the external self-determination. Now, if you go to the term of the self-determinations and specifically the internal self-determinations, so there is a closely link of the psychological well-being, so choice and what the behavior. So do you think that these internal self-determinisms to somewhat impact on the mental health of these people?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Because self-determination is one of the concepts that indigenous peoples, they embrace because they would like to see a clear role of them without external influence to decide on their, as I said, that if you would like to know about the self-determination, the basics of it is to freely determine not only your political status, but also freely determine your cultural, social, and spiritual status as well. So as I referred to Nagoya Protocol before, and in connection to that, for example, and I think it was Conference of the Parties, fourth Conference of the Parties of CBD, Biological Diversity Convention. I'm not sure if I'm correct, but in any case, there was a guideline adopted. It is called Akuakon guideline, and this guideline is about having environmental, social, cultural impact assessment, taking indigenous people on board. And to protect, for example, the sacred sites of indigenous people. So that is about, maintaining and guaranteeing the spiritual well-being of indigenous people.
Thank you. So my last question to Professor Hossain, that this is my very personal question, that I am very much interested about the Ainu population of the Hokkaido Island. So I know that you have done a very good job in regarding the different right issues of the Ainu people. So how this could happen in Japan, a so developed country, that the Ainu population, they are transformed into the Japanese populations, whether the rights have been humiliated?
Yeah, in Japanese society, actually, I mean, Ainu people were completely assimilated. So Ainu people, as you know, that they were living in the northern island of Japan, Hokkaido Island. So there, Japanese government was very, very successful to assimilate Ainu people. And since I have been traveling to Japan every now and then, I learned about the Ainu people, and I found that most of the Ainu people, even today, most of them, they are reluctant to identify them as Ainu. As Professor Castro said that, I mean, when you would like to be defined as indigenous people, actually there are two issues, two criteria. One is self-identification. You identify yourself as an indigenous people, then you have the social recognition. So you are recognized by the group that, yeah, you belong to this group of people. But for Ainu people, for example, I was also visiting the leader of the Ainu, Koichi Kayazawa, who was the plaintiff of Nibutani Dam case. And actually, Nibutani Dam case was one of the first case where Sapporo District Court clearly recognized Ainu people as indigenous people, and that took like over 20 years now. In 2019, or no, actually in 2000, yeah, it was 2019 April probably. Japanese government adopted a regulation defining or kind of recognizing Ainu people as indigenous people. So yeah, so now they started fighting back, and some of the people are kind of very active Ainu activists, and they are trying to raise their issues, and they are embracing those kind of regulations and instruments that recognize indigenous people as distinct people, and they try to push the government to not only recognize them as indigenous people, but also recognize their rights guaranteed within the framework of international law. Even though the regulation adopted in April last year, not last year, 2019, it is suggested that, I mean, this regulation is a success for the Ainu, but at the same time, the regulation was criticized by the Ainu because the regulation was adopted in order to, boost the tourism on Ainu land by the Japanese government without much recognizing Ainu people's right to self-determination by ensuring their right over, free, prior, and informed consent. Those norms were not clearly implemented when decisions are taken. Even though Ainu people were consulted when this regulation was adopted, but it was also criticized that government has, chosen some of the specific Ainu leaders, to invite them to adopt the regulation.
So there are some socio-political issues also, right? So in the word of this Professor Kamrul Hossain, that tourism, I would like to put some question to Nestor Castro, Professor Nestor Castro, like how much tourism in Southeast Asia influence the cultural demolitions of the indigenous populations. As you know that in China, the Masao tribal community is there in Yunnan province, and also Minangkabau populations. They are both of them matrilineal societies. So I'd like to know how much tourism is affecting their way of life or cultural life.
It has affected their life very much. But tourism, I think, is a double-edged sword. So it has positive impacts as well as negative impacts. Positive in the sense that, of course, it brings material benefits to the people, and we cannot belittle that, because the people themselves will say, without the tourists, without the backpackers, the government doesn't take care of us. So here we have income because of tourism. So they see that as a benefit. But on the other hand, when you talk about culture, so it's like selling your soul So there will be tourists that will come and say, oh, we want to see your primitive dances. Can you perform in front of us? Oh, we've seen that before. Why not show something very different? So it's really a double-edged sword. And different communities have taken a different track. Uh, some have like, for example, so to be more concrete, in the Philippines, in our mountain areas, so this is among the Ifugao, we have famous rice terraces. So it's a mountainous region, it's a very cold region. People go there and people do wood carving as a means of livelihood. But many of the sculptures that they make, from the point of view of the tourists, they don't look too nice. So there would be an influence to improve on their designs, but many of these improvements are non-indigenous, like they would do sculptures of elephants while we don't have elephants, or tigers, just for the sake of the enjoyment of tourists. And then if you take pictures together with women wearing their traditional costume, of course, the women will say, pay us first before you can take my picture. So it has monetized their culture. Now, for me, the bottom line is, if they sincerely want to change their culture, I have no problem with that. But if it is something that they are doing, but they don't really want to do it, but they're doing it for other purposes, then that's, for me, that's the negative part of it. So we go back to free and prior informed consent. Even tourism should have free and prior informed consent. Do you really want to allow foreign tourists to come into your area, to live into your homes, to learn your language? So if they say yes, I don't have any problem with it.
So the last questions regarding the indigenous population of Southeast Asia, that is, what about the women trafficking? Yes, I think this is very, very sensitive issues regarding the indigenous population. So I think you have very good ideas about what is going on in that particular case. Thank you.
Yes, this is more common in the in areas in northern Thailand, in Myanmar, and in northern Vietnam. Of course, because people coming from indigenous communities are poorer, so they're very vulnerable to uh, advances by others, saying, "Oh, you will earn a lot from this tourist industry," and it turns out it's sex tourism in bars in Bangkok, for example. So yes, they are very vulnerable, and it is the responsibility of course, the state. It's a responsibility of the state to protect them. Also, the responsibility of NGOs to support the cause of indigenous people, especially in women indigenous people who are victims of human trafficking. So they are recruited as sex workers or as domestic helpers, but with very little pay compared to others. And this trafficking is not just within the country. Some are even brought to the Middle East to work. It's really a big problem, and there should be a concerted effort to uh, to address this issue. Among indigenous peoples themselves, there's a need for information, education about these issues, because some of them just see the economic benefits in working outside of their territories, but they don't really know the repercussions, especially of the women. Sometimes they are even viewed positively by their home communities. they are like martyrs.
Yes.
They sacrifice in behalf of the community. I have interviewed some sex workers from northern Thailand, and they would even say, "This is my karma," uh, because I am repaying for the sins of my ancestors. But through this, I earn merit because I can improve the situation of my family. So they don't necessarily look at it differently, and that is where there should be sufficient education and information, because it's not on an even playing field. Yes, you see the benefits, but for the other one, they see it's really taking advantage of the situation.
Thank you very much. Actually, there are huge issues are going on throughout the world regarding the indigenous people, and specifically, I think this is the new platform we have built today, where the people who are passionate regarding the work in the indigenous people come together. So hope we will continue these sort of things for our future webinar. And from the Department of Anthropology, and also our institute, I already invited you. Please come to India and visit our different indigenous population. And this is our open invitation to you, right? So anyway, now Dr. Suchishmita Shanchudri, we are just crossed 3 hours. So this
Two more question, please.
okay. After
One question is to Professor Castro from my end. Is there any matrilineal communities in Philippines, and who are they, if there is any?
None. In the
None,
Philippines, none.
Okay.
Kinship is on both lines, father and mother side.
But earlier there was matrilineal tribe in Papua New Guinea, isn't it?
Yeah. In other parts of Southeast Asia,
Other
yes,
parts,
but
yes.
not in the Philippines.
Okay, thank you. And to Hossain sir, my students are asking two questions. I will take up the two questions very rapidly. One is whether there is any role of UN declaration regarding conflict resolution, and another is whether the indigenous people can set up their own educational system under the UN declaration, if there is any provision for setting up their own educational system. So these are two questions from our students.
kindly unmute, Professor Hossain, kindly unmute.
Okay, sorry. Concerning conflict resolution, mostly conflicts on indigenous lands are taking place between indigenous people and non-state actor, for example, mining companies, or kind of when government is taking up developmental activities, for example, construction of dams and that kind of activity. So when there are those kind of conflicts, and conflict resolutions are, as I said in my talk, nowadays taking place by having procedural means by which indigenous people themselves apply or kind of exercise their right to self-determination. So where you have a number of tools to use. So those tools are, for example, environmental impact assessment, consultation with the indigenous people's group, representative groups, institutions. In Finland, for example, also in Norway and Sweden, as I said, that we have Sami parliaments. So when you take a measure to give a license to a mining company to do mining, then the provision is that Sami parliament has to be consulted. In Finland, for example, Sami parliament has to be consulted because that is the representative body of the Sami people. And then again, you know, there are procedural elements where you gain free, prior, and informed consent. But there are issues, always there are issues. And these issues are settled by the judicial mechanism within the domestic context. And from the UN or United Nations, or from the, as I said, that I mean, actually declaration and other instrument, they provide standards. that states will have to comply with those standards, but then those standards have to be integrated within the national legal mechanism of the state. And the second question about whether indigenous people can establish their own educational institutions. Yes, they have right to establish their own educational institutions, for example, to promote their language, to promote their culture, to promote their values and customary norms that they practice. And that is actually being done. For example, in Finland, Sami educations are provided also by indigenous peoples organizations, but the states are obliged to promote that right for the indigenous groups, or by having, kind of arrangement with the indigenous peoples organization. But at the same time, indigenous people are also entitled to receive education and educational facilities offered by the government at the national level.
Thank you so much. I think our students are very much satisfied, as we are. Now, this is a time to finish our this webinar. So I would like to request Pushpalata Tigga, one of our energetic and very young teacher of our department, to say a few words, to give vote of thanks in this webinar and finish the program.
Thank you, Sujishmita Di. Very good evening to all. I am Pushpalata Tigga from Anthropology Department, and I would like to thank Sujishmita Sen Chaudhary, moderator of this webinar. Thank you to give this opportunity to me. And I would like to thank organizing committee of our college is Chandrima Bhattacharya. She is president of our governing body. Dr. Apurva Bandopadhyay, principal sir, IQAC member Mitali Gangopadhyay ma'am, and our faculty Tanushree ma'am, Shashwati ma'am, and our invited speaker Nestor Castro sir from Philippines. Thank you so much, sir, for your valuable and informative session. And invited speaker Professor Dr. Kamrul Hossain from Finland, University of Lapland. And thank you for your valuable and informative session. And our beloved students and Reena Di and Munidipa Chaudhary ma'am, she is present here, but I think she is left. And thank you, Suman Chakraborty sir. Thank you all. Thank you, Sujishmita Di.
Thank you, Pushpalata. And I think we should conclude now, Suman. And thank you again, Dr. Castro and Professor Hossain. We hope to meet again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.